Okay, well, hello and welcome once again to the UCCS Speaker Series. We're here today for our regular Wednesday series. Uh, Taking up the topic of elections, tomorrow we have another special presentation, this time on election reforms with Assemblyman Berman and Senator Umberg. This is sponsored by our colleagues at UC San Diego along with us, and we hope to see some of you there. Next week, on Wednesday, we have our regular speaker series talk on precision medicine with Atul Butte from UC San Francisco. And of course, many other events coming up. For a replay of those, just check out our website, uccs.ucdavis.edu. So now for today's presentation, I'm very pleased to introduce Brandy Nonnecke, who is founding director of the Citrus Policy Lab at UC Berkeley. Dr. Nonnecke is a PhD. She earned her PhD in mass communication from Penn State University. She has fellowships from all over the world, really. Harvard, the World Economic Forum, the Aspen Institute, and others. And she's the author of numerous refereed articles, white papers, and many articles in the lay press, including a fairly recent Wired op-ed entitled "California's Anti-Deep Fake Law is Far Too Feeble." So we look forward to hearing more about that and other related matters momentarily. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Brandy Nonnecke.
Thank you so much for the introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here today, and I'm excited to talk about some of these threats of computational propaganda campaigns in the election. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here so you can see my slides. One second. Okay, you should be able to see my slides now. So I'm from Citrus and the Banatow Institute. Citrus stands for the Center for Information Technology Research in the Interest of Society. The executive director is Camille Crittenden. I'm the director of the Citrus Policy Lab. You can see our contact information here if you'd like to reach out with any questions or concerns. Before I dig into my presentation today, I wanted to give a quick overview of Citrus and the Banatow Institute. It is one of the largest organized research units within the University of California system. We're headquartered at UC Berkeley, but we also operate on the campuses of UC Davis, UC Merced, and UC Santa Cruz. You'll see on this diagram how we split up our work. We have the research thrust area where you can see our work on sustainable infrastructures that looks at, the water energy nexus, smart grids, smart cities. We have people and robots where they look at innovative research to think about human machine teaming. But then we also have our technology and society work, and that's where the Citrus Policy Lab fits in. And it's joined by the Future of Work initiative, of course, a very pressing issue that we're looking at right now, how emerging technologies are affecting the future of work, and also the Women in Technology initiative, where we look at ways to support greater inclusion of women in the tech sector. You can also see on here a list of our different resources that are available. So any of those joining today who are faculty, staff, or students on the campuses of Berkeley, Davis, Merced, or Santa Cruz, I encourage you to check out those resources. So the Citrus Policy Lab was founded in 2018, and the goal is to support interdisciplinary tech policy research engagement to benefit society. You'll see the URL down there at the bottom. I encourage you to go check out some of our work, and I'll give a quick overview of some of the work that we lead in this space. So here you can see sort of our main core 8 research thrusts. On the top left, you see computational propaganda. That's really the focus of my presentation today, is to highlight some of the research we've been doing in that space. I'll talk a little bit later in this presentation on what we actually mean by computational propaganda and dig into some of our research where we've actually done some empirical analysis of the prevalence of bots in targeting contentious political issues as a means to influence voting behavior before the 2018 US midterm elections. You'll also see on here the area of inclusive AI. We do quite a bit of research that looks at what levers can we pull, policy or otherwise, to better ensure that artificial intelligence is designed and deployed in a way that has a maximizing societal benefit. We also do a lot of work on digital inclusion. Of course, our mandate is development of technology solutions in the interest of society, and a lot of that technology being able to be used by people means that they need to have internet access. Some of the other work around democratic innovations, Camille Crittenden was the chair of a statewide working group that looked at the benefits and drawbacks of the use of blockchain technology across the state of California. That report was published in July, and very soon on the Citrus Policy Lab website, there will be a report published where she looked at the ways that blockchain can be used to support marginalized or at-risk communities, especially homeless. So stay tuned, that report will be published soon. Mentioning reports, you can check out our reports at citruspolicylab.org/reports. Here's a few screenshots of our recent reports. Obviously the health, wildfires, and climate change in California report is extremely relevant right now. We've also done quite a bit of work on digital ID and its effects on society. You'll see 2 of those reports listed there. But one report I wanted to highlight in particular is our work looking at the effect of emerging technologies on public sector work. So you can see the URL there to go check out the report. As I understand it, these slides will be made available. They will be posted on the webpage where you signed up for this talk in a PDF format. So no need to copy everything down. It'll be made available on there very soon. In coordination with the release of that white paper, we did host a public session that discussed some of the main findings. So that recording is also available, and go check it out. Another research project I wanted to mention before digging into my talk, we are collaborating with the California Department of Technology to do an assessment of the use of AI across state agencies and to provide recommendations to help guide the California state government's procurement, development, implementation, and monitoring of AI in state agencies. And that report will be released in early December. We published quite a few op-eds and blog posts. So I've included screenshots of a few of them here. You'll see it spans all of the different research areas I highlighted earlier. Another thing I'm really excited to announce, last week we released this public database of all California and federal AI related legislation. And if you are a data geek like me, you'll have a lot of fun digging into this. We recorded a summary of what the intent of the legislation, and we also gave focus tags. We documented who proposed the legislation, what party are they from, so you can really play around and see, are Democrats introducing certain types of legislation targeting AI in these areas more than Republicans, how many of Democrats introduced versus Republicans. So it's really a lot of fun to dig into that database. But let's dig into the main presentation today on deepfakes, disinformation, and democracy. These are all issues that are coming up a lot in the media. And I hope that by the end of today's talk, you'll have a better understanding of what the actual risks are for these technologies in the upcoming election and in future elections, some of the legislation that has been passed in the state of California and its potential effectiveness or ineffectiveness to actually stem these malicious uses, and some concrete technology strategies that I think should be implemented starting today. So to start us off, computational propaganda is the use of AI and automation to influence public opinion on social media. So I'm sure everybody on the call has heard about Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election, the role of bots in targeting undecided voters. So that is part of what we would consider computational propaganda campaigns. I also often hear people interchanging the use of the terms misinformation and disinformation. I'd just like to express that those concepts are indeed different. Misinformation is false information, rumors, and pranks that are spread. There's not necessarily a malicious intent for spreading misinformation. It could just be hearsay, you heard something and you've shared it on social media. Now, disinformation, on the other hand, is a form of misinformation that is deliberately deceptive. So the intent there is really try to deceive the public and spreading false narratives. And this is really the primary focus of our research, is around the disinformation. So some ways that disinformation is spread is through social media bots. And I want to explain how we define social media bots. So social media bots can either be fully or semi-automated social media accounts, and their goal is to really mimic human-like behavior. But I'd also like to say that bots can be benign or they can be malicious. Most often, media frames bots in the malicious side, but you can create a social media bot that, for example, maybe at any time somebody tweeted, "I love you," the bot would respond, "I love you too." It's an automated response. Obviously, it's not malicious. It's actually very nice. And there's all sorts of examples of these benign and positive bots that can be deployed. Now, the bot detection software that is often used, for example, Indiana University's Botometer, they're really targeting the identification of political bots. And they look at actually 1,000 different features to predict whether or not an account is a bot. And it's on a scale from 0 to 1. So if the score is a 0, it's very unlikely that it's a bot. If it's a 1, according to their model, they think it's probably, definitely a political bot based off of their factors. And I keep saying this based off of their factors because there has been research that has shown that the model is prone to some false positive and false negative errors. But I would also caution that every model has false positive and false negative errors. And the ability to identify bots is getting more difficult as those who are utilizing bots and creating them change the behavior in order to evade detection. But then also a lot of the bots that are, I would say, quote unquote, bots that are effective in these campaigns, they're actually not 100% automated. There's a person behind them actually typing out comments, typing out tweets, or replying to other people. So it's not 100% automated. This bot just working on its own, but there's really people behind these campaigns. So that's something that we don't often hear about when it's covered in the media, that there are people behind these. And I just wanted to point out another bot detection software, Bot Sentinel. There's all sorts that are available. I also wanted to discuss some of the bot types that are available. And so, for example, one is an astroturfing political bot. And this is a political bot that tries to give the presentation that it is a ground up movement. It's part of the community, but really it's somebody outside of that community who is trying to make it look like they're part of that community, and they're strategically emphasizing a certain point, or continuing a narrative to polarize people within those groups. You also have, of course, fake follower bots who just follow accounts to give the high follower counts that are often inappropriately conflated with widespread support for an individual. And then, like I said before, some of these innocuous bots or friendly bots, they can also be self-declared. They come out and they say that they're bots. And then, of course, spammer bots, those that just are posting spam on social media. So I'm going to dig into some of the computational propaganda campaigns that we've seen targeting elections. Of course, there's been extensive research over the last few years on the effects of these campaigns within the 2016 presidential election, the 2018 midterm elections, and then as we, in the next couple of weeks, finalize the 2020 presidential election. The Department of Homeland Security released a report now about 2 weeks ago. I think that it was released the first week of October, this Homeland Threat Assessment. And in that report, they do note that there are foreign accounts that are still perpetuating some of these false narratives and engaging in computational propaganda as a means to try to sow discord and influence voting behavior, and then also to suppress voting. This is very concerning that we're continuing to see this threat of foreign actors trying to interfere in our election. I also want to point out that not all of the nefarious or malicious bot accounts are coming from foreign adversaries. There are also accounts that are run by domestic groups here in the United States. So it's not a problem of 100% foreign adversaries affecting our election through the manipulation of public opinion on social media, but this is also a tactic that's being deployed internally. So it's coming from, also inside the country. I felt like this quote from Eileen Donahoe, who's the executive director at the Global Digital Policy Incubator at Stanford, really hits an important point about computational propaganda. And one of the goals is, once you get out this political narrative that's shifting or it's polarizing or providing disinformation or false information, it's almost impossible to backtrack before and change that narrative back. It's an incredibly difficult process. So the effectiveness of these campaigns is quite high because of that inability to correct information. Essentially, like once the cat's out of the bag, it's hard to get it back in. So within the Citrus Policy Lab, we've been leading research over the last 2 years that really tried to do an analysis of, well, what is the prevalence and role of these bots in trying to influence public opinion on social media? And we knew from the research literature that they were targeting contentious political debates before elections. And so our first study, we collected tweets that were targeting women's reproductive rights issues before the 2018 US midterm elections. And we collected about 1.7 million tweets from over 460,000 unique handles. And this is done through the Twitter search and stream APIs. If you have an interest in collecting tweets yourself, we published a guide on how you can pull tweets from Twitter's API. It's located on our blog page if you want to learn how you can do it yourself. But to analyze those accounts, since 1.7 million, that's a lot. Where do you even start? How do you dig into this data to find out what are the important accounts to be looking at and their effects? We first perform a social network analysis to see which accounts are the most influential in the network. We take those accounts and then we ran them through Indiana University's Botometer to identify out of the most influential accounts. So in other words, those accounts that have the greatest control over the flow of information in the network, those that are being retweeted a lot by others. Are they a bot or are they not a bot according to this model? Those accounts that were identified as bots are highly centralized, the top 10, and the top 10 most influential non-bot accounts. We pulled all of their tweets and we coded all of their tweets. And we found that both pro-choice and pro-life bots were highly centralized, highly influential in our network. And this is actually in alignment with prior research literature that says it's not usually just one side attacking an issue to polarize. It's actually both, with the goal of keeping them apart from each other. We also saw that pro-life bots were more likely to send and retweet harassing language, and that pro-choice bots were more likely to perpetuate political divisiveness. That report has been published and you can access it on our webpage. Right now, we're wrapping up some research that looks at the targeting of the immigration debate. We applied the same methodology, pulled from Twitter search and stream APIs. This time it was about 675,000 tweets from over 145,000 unique handles. We applied that same methodology, first doing the social network analysis, identifying those most influential accounts, then running those through Indiana University's Botometer, pulling the tweets from the 10 most influential Twitter bot accounts, and then coding them. Here are key findings. Bots were influential in spreading harassment, disinformation, and perpetuating political divisiveness. Interestingly, in this research, all bots actually presented an anti-immigration stance. From prior research literature, we thought that they would target both sides, pro-immigration and anti-immigration, but in this, it was 100% anti-immigration. We also collected tweets that were sent out by President Trump during the same time period, and we looked at any of his tweets that were targeting immigration. And we noticed that when President Trump would tweet harassing language targeting immigrants, we would see a steep uptick in the number of harassing tweets sent by bot accounts targeting immigrants. And the same for when he would attack the Democratic Party on its stance on immigration. Right afterward, we would see a large uptick in bots sending out the same types of language, even using the same wording and phrasing. Another issue I want to get into today is around deepfakes. And this is a topic that gets a lot of press because it's so scary to think about. Imagine seeing a video or you yourself having a video created of you that isn't you, and you trying to explain to people that it's not you. It's a very scary thought. So deepfakes are the use of AI to generate deceptive audio or visual media of individuals doing or saying things they did not. So here's just one example from Jimmy Fallon, where the technology has been applied to actually move where it looks like it's Trump on the right, but that is not Trump. That's a deepfake of him. Within computational propaganda, in this idea of deepfakes and how effective they can be, one of the greatest challenges is that essentially, if there's no definitive truth, then anything can be a lie. So it's very difficult if you have a potential deepfake out there to prove that it's not true. I'll talk about some technologies later that can be used to identify, but there's this idea of the liar's dividend. So deepfakes can make it easier for liars to avoid accountability for things that are in fact true. They can say, this video actually isn't me, it's a deepfake. And then once you insert that, the ability, the deniability, the public may pick up on that. And no matter how much convincing you try to do that it's real, if it is in fact real, you may never be able to fully convince them. There's a lot of concern about deepfakes in elections, and their implementation has been extremely limited for a number of reasons. First, the technology by and large, it's pretty easy to tell if you're looking at a deepfake that it isn't real. Just by a layperson looking at it, you can tell it's just, it doesn't look right. The person's never blinking. There's some weird movement in the mouth. So right now they're not very convincing, but there have been some deployments, like in Delhi, India. This candidate used deepfakes to actually, make his videos, make him look like he was speaking in other languages so that he could reach all constituents. And so this is one application right now. It was clearly communicated that these were created as such, and people knew that he actually didn't make the videos in all the different languages. But there's another really interesting issue coming up, because if we think about, should there be a ban on deepfakes and their influence on elections, I wanted to give this example, kind of a counter example of, well, maybe it can be a tool that's used, and if you're clear about it, it could be a tool that's used to actually mobilize voters. So what you're seeing here is a snapshot of a deep fake that was created with Joaquin Oliver, who was unfortunately shot and killed in February 14th at the Stoneman Douglas High School shooting in Parkland, Florida. And in this video, Joaquin is urging people to vote in the 2020 election and support stricter gun laws. It's clear at the beginning of the video they communicate that it is a deep fake. But I think that there's this point that deepfake technology can be an expressive form of media that could be used by certain stakeholders to communicate a concern and help mobilize people toward positive change. So, we have this deep focus on technological sophistication in our mitigation right now, and I think we're sort of missing some of the critical issues that we need to be focusing on. And that is, cheap fakes instead of deep fakes. These are also sometimes called shallow fakes. And cheap fakes are videos that are manipulated using less sophisticated technology, like Photoshop or other tools, to manipulate a video. So many of you may remember the videos that were modified of Nancy Pelosi that were slowed down to try to make her look like she was slurring her speech, like she was ill or she was drunk, to try to undermine her character. These types of videos are actually extremely effective at influencing public opinion. They're easy to make, easy to distribute. And I really appreciated this quote from Professor Hani Farid at UC Berkeley. He's an expert in studying deepfakes. You can think of the deepfake as the bazooka and the video splicing as a slingshot, and it turns out the slingshot works. So one reason why these things work are because of two heuristics. So we have an affect heuristic that we employ where we have a focus on shocking emotional content. So, I also think of this as like the rubbernecking effect. As human beings, we have a tendency to focus on things that are potentially scary, that could cause us harm, risky. We have this animal-like instinct to focus on them. So when you see this on social media, you focus on it. But then what's also tied to this is the availability heuristic. So if you start to see this content more and more frequently, you become more likely to believe it. So if we think about combining the affect heuristic of seeing shocking content with its availability, seeing it many, many times, when we think about social media is a powder keg for the ability for these two heuristics to come together and really manipulate public opinion. So what are some strategies that should be implemented? Well, I'm sure many of you are hearing about Section 230. It's coming up more and more frequently in the news. President Trump issued an executive order targeting Section 230 and its changes. And now Section 230 is part of the Communications Decency Act, introduced in the 1990s. And within it, there's a sentence that has 26 words. And those 26 words are often called the 26 words that created the internet. And those 26 words are: no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. The goal of implementing Section 230, when the internet was still in its early stages of development, was to create a liability shield for platforms so that they wouldn't be liable for content posted. And the idea there is that if we didn't have this liability shield in place, those platforms wouldn't have been able to grow. They would have had to have focused completely on policing their content, making sure that nothing is posted on there that's inappropriate. Of course, there are some limitations, like you cannot post copyrighted content, and then also you cannot post child pornography. The platforms are held liable for that. They must remove that content once it's found. But Section 230 now is coming under increasing scrutiny as revelations of the effects of the spread of disinformation and its effects on elections is coming to light. There's some federal legislation I want to touch on. Over the next few slides, I'm going to give some examples of federal legislation, then dig into some California legislation. So at the federal level, there has been legislation proposed around bots. We have the Bots Research Act to look more at, what are bots, how do they perform? And then the Bot Disclosure and Accountability Act, where it would compel the public disclosure of the use of these automated systems. At the federal level, there's also legislation targeting deepfakes. I think for better or for worse, potentially focusing just on deepfakes, there's this, I guess, pressure to focus on, I think, because it is so scary. But I really question the effectiveness of this legislation focused just on deepfakes. And I'll get into more of that in a minute when I talk about California's deepfake legislation and why I think that it's going to be ineffective. In California, we do have the bot bill, and this was signed into law. And the bot bill requires the disclosure of bots that attempt to influence California residents' voting or purchasing behaviors. So how many of you on Twitter have seen a bot account that's trying to influence you, say, hey, I'm a bot trying to influence you in the election. Here's this article, this damning article about Democratic presidential nominee Biden. We don't see that, right? It's not very effective right now. It's not compelling those individuals creating the accounts to say that they are those bot accounts. There's other weaknesses, like what is and is not considered a bot. As I said before, bots can be fully automated, semi-automated. Even if they're semi-automated, what is semi-automated enough to be considered a bot, with, rather than a human being using some aspects of automation to, optimize their social media. This idea of the requirement of self-disclosure of a bot by creator, like I just said, if you are creating a malicious bot to influence someone in an election, the likelihood that you would tell them that is completely nil, zero. They're not going to do it. Why would they? And there's also this lack of responsibility on platforms to identify bots. And this ties again to that section 230 and some of the content moderation, compelling them to do this, according to those who have drafted some of the legislation, is too heavy a burden. I tend to disagree, and I'll explain why in the next slides. And then in California, we also have California's anti-deepfake law, which was also signed into law last year. I omitted to put that on here, but it was signed into law last year. And that prohibits a person, committee, or other entity from distributing with actual malice. That's an important preface here, with actual malice, deepfake images, audio, or video within 60 days of an election. It also requires the disclosure of the manipulated content. I wrote an op-ed that discussed why I think California's anti-deepfake law is far too feeble, why it won't be effective. It's published in Wired, so you can check it out there. But I'm going to go over the 4 main flaws of that law right now. The first is timing. So the law only applies to the distribution of malicious deepfakes within 60 days of an election. Well, this overlooks the nature of the internet, where content can live on indefinitely. So the content could have been posted 90 days before an election, and it still lives on. It's still available, to have the negative impact. Another issue is misplaced responsibility. The law places responsibility on the producers of deepfakes to self-identify manipulated content, and on social media platform users to flag suspicious content. Again, this is like asking a swindler to tell someone before they swindle them, oh, by the way, I'm a swindler and I'm going to cheat you out of money right now. They're not going to do it. They're not going to say that they're producing a malicious deepfake. The third is burden of proof. You have to prove that the deepfake has been determined to have actual malice. That is going to be a very lengthy review process and how you define actual malice. And while you're in the process of determining whether or not a deepfake has actual malice, that deepfake will remain online, spreading, perhaps gaining virality, especially if the media says that video is under review on whether or not it has actual malice, and it could cause greater harm. So, while I think it's important that we have this burden of proof of actual malice, because you want to protect content that is of satire and parody using deepfake technology, you want to protect that right to expression. The process through which you're determining actual malice needs to be concrete, efficient, quick. But that itself is a very difficult process. And then the fourth flaw, I think, is inadequate remedies. So even if a deepfake is flagged, it's determined that it's actual malice, the video is removed, there is no obligation compelling the platform or any other entity to go back and tell the individuals who were exposed to that video that was a deepfake and you were being manipulated. So there's no remedy. There's no way to correct that negative exposure and its negative effects. So I want to talk quickly about some technology strategies that I think are available. And I've split them into 4 areas. So education, detection, authentication, and intervention. First and foremost, educating the public on what these technologies are, what they look like, how they behave, how do you spot them? What do you do when you spot them? It is critical. So I've listed a few resources here. That this is not exhaustive. There are many resources. These are just a few that I wanted to share with you today. Some are really fun, like the Spot the Deepfake quiz. That's a lot of fun. It's run by Microsoft. You can play around with it. I recommend it because sometimes it'll trick you. We're also leading a deepfake education challenge. The Citrus Policy Lab is with the Silicon Valley Leadership Group Foundation, where we have asked students all the way from high school to grad school to create videos to teach the public about deepfakes. What are they? How do you spot them? And what do you do to protect yourself from being manipulated? So those, the winning videos from that challenge will be provided online soon. And then for detection, of course, the platforms are implementing their own detection techniques right now, but I think that there's an important role to be played by having the public's, the general public be able to use some of these tools. Now, some of these tools do have plugins for your browser that you can use right now. Put them on your browser, and then when you're on Twitter, you can click a button and see, according to this model, is it a likelihood that this is a bot or not? Of course, again, as I mentioned before, there are these false positives and false negatives that are prevalent in those models. So you do need to take the determination with a little grain of salt, but it does help you kind of question at least, what's available or what those accounts are. There's also new tools coming out all the time for deepfake detection. Microsoft has a tool that's available. One that I think is extremely interesting that came out about a month ago is this fake catcher. So it actually looks and shifts in color change in your face from blood circulation. Now, to our human eye, we don't see it, but you can train these models that will see a natural shift in color change that happens naturally as blood circulates through your body. So they've started to use that tool to be able to identify whether or not a video is of a real human being or if it's been manipulated and it's actually a deep fake. There's also some great work on authentication of media content. One reason why these campaigns are successful is because we can't guarantee the authenticity of the content. So there's this San Diego-based startup called TruePic, and they have partnered with Qualcomm to develop a smartphone feature that is integrated with the camera. So anytime you take a video or a photo, there is a secure tag on that that gives the timestamp and location. And there's work right now to make sure that platforms are able to capture some of that information. And then I think there should be a process where on those platforms it says whether or not that content has been verified, that it's from that timestamp and that location. And I think this is a really important step in mitigating the harm from inauthentic media by being able to authenticate some. And then the last is around intervention. So once platforms identify this content, they should flag, suppress, and or remove that content. I think that platforms should do a lot more in flagging accounts to educate the public on what they look like. So if there's a bot account that is being run, of course, they need to define what is and is not considered a bot. Like I said before, do we only define bots as those that are fully automated? Do we define them also as those that are semi-automated? If we do, what's the threshold of semi-automation before you would flag them as a bot? But I think it's important, on Twitter, for example, that they say this account exhibits some semi-automation features and educate the public more that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a nefarious account. I use software to automate sending tweets from my account. So in fact, my account was semi-automated. We just need to educate the public on that. Also defining malicious content and suppressing that content in the feed. But there's also a caution there that if you are suppressing content, you need to be transparent in why. And then another tactic that's often used now is content that is being distributed from one source. Let's say it's one article that is disinformation or fake news. That URL will not be allowed to be posted on social media. So it stops the ability for that content to be spread. Now, the obvious workaround for that is if the nefarious actor just changes the URL. So then it sort of becomes a cat and mouse game as the platform tries to figure out what new URL they're using and then block that. And then also, I think that there's a lot of important work to be done on looking at these influential posts with false information. You can identify them quickly because those are the ones that are going to be the most impactful. A lot of people are being exposed to them, identify whether or not the content needs to have a flag that the content is inaccurate or misleading, like we've seen platforms do actually with, for example, President Trump's tweets on election interference. So I think that is important role that platforms they're playing. So what needs to be done? You need implementation of bot and deepfake detection software on social media. As I mentioned before, there's browser plugins that are available. I think that the platforms should communicate the use of this technology. If they flag accounts, they should indicate that. If the account is using bots or if the content is a deepfake, it should be labeled regardless of the intent of the content. I think more information is just going to be a lot more helpful in educating the public. Platforms, they should flag that content, and then harmful content should be suppressed. There's one very important point I want to bring up. Platforms are private sector companies. The First Amendment protects against government censorship. Essentially, platforms can suppress speech. It's a private platform. I do think, though, as platforms become more tightly entwined with our public sphere, I think that they have a moral obligation to communicate when they're suppressing content and why. But there's not really a legal obligation for them to do that at this time, which is one reason why Section 230 is being reevaluated right now about their legal requirements for content moderation and transparency. So I've listed quite a few of our resources here that you can access. These are all referenced in earlier slides. And there's my contact information. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to dig into some of your questions now.